So it's 1 o'clock in Barcelona. I think we should start. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the webinar. I am Guillem Adís, Director at Autoocupació. We are an NGO based in Catalonia, supporting underserved entrepreneurs since 1986. I'm representing here EMAP, the Network for Migrant Entrepreneurs to Scale Up and Grow, funded by the European Union under the COSME program. You can find more information in our website. It's www.men-app.eu. We will share in the chat the website. As part of our activities, we are delivering 3 webinars to support practitioners to better design and deliver the programs for migrant entrepreneurs. Today, we will focus on training programs, and we are very lucky to have Chris Massey leading the webinar. Next Tuesday, the 11th at the same time, the webinar will focus on access to finance programs for migrant entrepreneurs, and it will be led by Klaas Molenaar, an expert on access to finance for underserved. And on Tuesday, the 18th, at the same time, the webinar will focus on mentoring programs and will be led by Bob Garvey, an expert on mentoring that he's joining us today. If you're interested in receiving more information about the EMAP activities, I would like to invite you to share your contact details in the chat or to contact us through the EMAP website. I would like to invite you to actively participate. Ask Chris whatever you want and share, please, your experience training migrant entrepreneurs. I also want to announce that the webinar will be recorded and it will be accessible in the EMAP website in a couple of days. And now it's time to briefly introduce you to Chris Massey. I knew Chris in 2014 when he started joining Youth Business International and when we were designing a new training program for young entrepreneurs in Madrid. Chris is passionate about intercultural communication and entrepreneurship training, and as you will see, a great facilitator and also a good friend. Chris, please, the floor is yours.
Guillem, thank you very much for the introduction. That's great. Yeah, I'd like to thank EMAP for inviting me here, and Guillem especially for that, and I'd like to welcome all of you to this webinar. As Guillem said, please feel free to participate actively. I can see from your introductions that we have a lot of experts here on the session, so please contribute your questions and your experiences in the chat. That would be really helpful. Just an introduction of me, for those of you who don't know me. I worked with YBI, Youth Business International, for 4 years, building their training programs, helping YBI members around the world develop their training programs. Some of those worked with migrants, some didn't. I've been a migrant myself, albeit kind of an opportunity migrant rather than a necessity migrant. I've lived for more than half of my working life in other countries. So a lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about today around fitting into a country, not having the language or the tools or the knowledge to really be successful in a country, I've got real kind of first-hand experience of that. And that's what led me to study intercultural communication. So that's just a little bit about who I am and why I'm talking to you. But we have quite a lot to get through today, and only 1 hour to do it. So we could talk for days about how to build on programs for migrant entrepreneurs. We've only got 1 hour, so I'm just going to focus on 3 different areas. Firstly, to set the scene, really, I'm going to look at some challenges for migrant entrepreneurs. What are the challenges that they face? And there are many, many different types of migrant entrepreneurs. So I've narrowed that down to just a few areas of challenges that can be quite common to most. Then we're going to look at some ideas for programming, for migrant entrepreneurship programs, whether you include migrant entrepreneurs in your day-to-day programs, or whether you build specific programs for them to go through as just a group of migrant entrepreneurs. And then we're going to have a look at the tools and the skills that we give to our trainers who are working with migrant entrepreneurs. I'm going to be talking about migrants generally. I'm not going to be focusing on refugees. I'm not going to be focusing on first or second generation migrants. So we've got a broad spectrum there. Because of this, please forgive me if I'm going to be quite general about a lot of the things that I say, but please, as I say, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. Also, I'm not going to go into too much detail about program content and program design. We're going to be speaking in general terms, and I'm going to be giving you some food for thought, some kinds of areas that you can be thinking about that maybe you haven't looked at before. Maybe we can help you break some of your assumptions about what training programs for migrant entrepreneurs should look like, and maybe reveal some of our own blind spots that we have when it comes to programming for different groups of people with different needs. If at any time I'm talking too quickly because I'm trying to get through my content, then please in the chat box tell me to slow down. I get, as Guillaume said, I get quite passionate about this, so I can talk quite quickly sometimes. So if I'm going too fast, please tell me to slow down. So before we get into the content, I wanted to look at how I'm going to frame this discussion. As I said, I'm not going to look in too much detail at the structure of migrant entrepreneurship programs. I know that all organizations out there are different. They all have different resources. They all work with different groups. So me giving any advice on how to structure a program would probably be meaningless to most of you. But what I am going to focus on, the approach that I'm going to take, is looking at these kind of commonly overlooked ingredients for successful training programs. Quite often in training programs, it's easy to focus on the content. What do our entrepreneurs need to know? What are the skills that they need to develop? And it's quite easy to focus on that and forget the training environment that we're working with. And I'm going to be focusing much more on that human side of the training program, setting up a very human and understanding, accepting atmosphere. So these elements of trust is something that I'm going to keep coming back to. Do the entrepreneurs trust you as a trainer? Do they trust your organization? Do they trust that they're in a safe place where they can share their ideas, their business ideas? No one's going to steal their ideas. And do they feel safe to share failures, to share experiences? So this idea of psychological safety, I don't know if any of you know about Google's work on Project Aristotle that talked about psychological safety being one of the defining factors in the success of groups and teams. So do entrepreneurs feel safe in your training programs to discuss their fears and their worries? And is the training program appropriate, not just in terms of content and what does the entrepreneur need to know, but is it delivered in a way that is appropriate to my needs as a migrant entrepreneur? Is it delivered in the right language? Does it cover the right basic concepts for the context that we're working in? And finally, the group dynamic. So I'm going to be talking about group trainings rather than one-to-one trainings or consultancy. How do we build that group dynamic so that the group takes on a lot of the learning and a lot of the knowledge creation? How do we get the entrepreneurs in the group to trust each other and rely on each other for their learning? So that's the approach that I'm going to be taking throughout this session. So straight on to challenges for migrant entrepreneurs. Just going to take a brief look at some areas that are key challenges for certain groups of migrant entrepreneurs. Not all migrant entrepreneurs will have these issues, but I just want to bring these up to highlight some of the issues that migrant entrepreneurs can have. So we're going to start off by looking at language as a barrier to learning. I'm sure that some of you know migrant entrepreneurs can come to your door with a variety of levels of language ability. Maybe some of them are fluent in your native languages and the language that the training will be conducted in. Maybe others need very, very basic support with their language and maybe can't even access training in your native language. They might have problems with idiomatic language, the local idioms that are used in your country. They might have learned your language in school or at university, but they might not understand the day-to-day way that language is used in society in your country. And many of them won't have technical business language in the target culture language. And this lack of fluency, or this barrier, linguistic barrier, can really lead to frustration for entrepreneurs. It can lead to exhaustion, because working all day in another language can be extremely tiring. I often liken it to driving a car. And it's fine for the first hour or two, but after that you start to get tired and exhausted if you're working constantly in another language. And if you can't communicate with the people around you in a way that you really want to, then this can lead to isolation for many entrepreneurs. And in a training group, that's not something we want. We want all the entrepreneurs to feel like they're part of the group. So language is one of the most basic and most obvious barriers that migrant entrepreneurs can encounter. Next one we have is the lack of contextual knowledge about the country they're moving to. Now, this can range from very, very basic contextual knowledge of how systems and processes work in the country. How do I open a bank account? How do I get a mobile phone? How do I register a business? Now, there are a lot of local entrepreneurs who don't know some of this stuff, but especially for new arrivals to a country, this adds a whole level of complexity to their learning. And they need to get to absorb this information that natives of that country will have absorbed over decades. They need to absorb that information very quickly in order to be able to access all the opportunities out there. So there's that kind of structural side of the contextual knowledge, but also there's the social and economic context of a new country that can cause issues for newcomers to a country. How do markets work in this country? How do people buy things? Where do people find out information about new products? All of this can be very different from the migrant's home country to their new home country. So how do we give migrants this kind of knowledge about the countries that they've come to live in? Networks are an interesting one because they can vary very greatly depending on the type of migrant. We all know that to entrepreneurs, networks are vital. They not only help you market your products and find out about market opportunities, but they help you develop your skills. They help you develop your your business opportunities and expand your business. Now, many migrants don't, I mean, newcomers, especially refugees to a country, if they come as individuals or just the small family group, will have no network at all. So there's no one there to support them, no one there to give them advice in the same way that they might do in their home country. And that can be very demoralizing. It can apply a lot of psychological pressure, because we also use our networks to relieve our psychological pressure and share our worries. So that can be one issue, one extreme end of a lack of networks. But the other end is migrants who come into already well-established national or ethnic migrant communities within a country. So they might come from a given country, and they might move to an area of a city in a new country where there are a lot of nationals from their home country. There might be shops in their own language. There might even be newspapers in their own language. And what this can do is lead to an isolation or a separation from the wider country as a whole. So what we need to do in those situations is focus on integration and bridging the gaps between the host community and the migrant communities. So how can we, as support agencies, provide those bridges which might show migrant entrepreneurs new opportunity, or show them areas where they're going to reach challenges with their business models. And the final area of challenge is one that we'll come to look at later on. And it's my area of interest is the cultural values that migrant entrepreneurs bring with them. Now, culture, as we'll go on to see, influences behaviors and it influences preferences. So my culture influences how comfortable I am in certain situations. Am I comfortable with risk? Am I comfortable with people talking quickly or loudly or showing emotion? And it influences how I will behave in given circumstances. If my behavior, my culturally motivated behavior is unacceptable in the culture that I am working in, then I need to learn that very quickly, and I need to learn to adapt my behavior to make it more acceptable in the country that I'm trying to do business in. And culture not only influences our own behaviors, but it influences our interpretations of other people's behaviors, and this can really impact on migrants building relationships and building trust. As a British person, one example that I'm always confronted with when people tell me about working with the British is the idea that British people will quite often seem very friendly on a first meeting and say, "Oh, you must come round to dinner." And then no follow-up, no nothing, no invitation. And that can leave people feeling betrayed or feeling that they can't trust what this person says. Whereas in the UK, that's just it's a form of greeting. It's not really an invitation. So the way you interpret the behaviors of the people from the local culture around you can really kind of put barriers in the way of you as a migrant entrepreneur building relationships. So all of these challenges, these areas of challenge, they're all elements that are associated with relocation and culture shock, acculturative stress, as it's known in the research. They all have an impact. They can lead to increased cognitive load. So this means that you don't have as much space left in your brain to work on other tasks. It can lead to stress and feelings of isolation and separation, which can in turn lead to lack of self-esteem, lack of motivation. And all of this has a direct impact on business creation. So if you're in this kind of situation, you won't be in a place to focus on your business. You won't be in a place to make informed decisions about your business, to plan and strategize, and to be creative. So part of our role as trainers of migrant entrepreneurs is to minimize these barriers, to help the entrepreneurs remove these barriers as much as possible, so that they don't suffer these negative impacts of the barriers, and they can really get on with focusing on building their business. Yeah, so we're going to kind of look at look at some empathy, trying to see the world through the lens of migrant entrepreneurs. I can see we've got a comment in the group chat here. So positive psychology can support migrant entrepreneurs a lot to overcome these challenges and flourish. Yes, Gabriella, that's very true. So I'm really focusing today on that psychological side of the training program, and how we can get migrant entrepreneurs into that psychological state where they're willing to accept our training. There's no point in putting people through training programs if they're not in a position to accept what we're talking about. Excuse me while I have a quick drink of water here. If any of you have any more comments or questions as we go along, like Gabrielle, please put them in the chat. So this brings us on to programming for migrants. So if these are some of the challenges that migrant entrepreneurs come to us with, what can we do about those? And a big question here before we talk about this is asking yourself, well, where does my organization's remit begin and end? Is it my responsibility to focus on language needs? Is it my responsibility to focus on the psychological well-being of migrant entrepreneurs? The answer for some of you will be yes, definitely, and the answer for others may be no, we don't have the resources for that. So with a lot of the stuff that I'm going to talk about, maybe you can ask yourselves, is this something that we can deliver and that we should be delivering? Or are there elements that we can partner with other organizations or cross-refer to other organizations who are already working in this space? This might be the case for language support, for example. Who else is providing language support for migrants, and can we cross-refer our entrepreneurs to these other organizations? I'm not saying that you should be delivering all of these elements that I'm going to go on to discuss. So we talked about language being an issue for some migrant entrepreneurs, and this can be the case with new arrivals, but it can also be the case for maybe older generation, first generation migrant entrepreneurs who have lived in a very strong migrant community within the country for a long time. People might not have adapted their language abilities to the country that they're living in. So well, there are a number of approaches that we can use to help migrants get beyond this this issue of language within the training room. So it might be that your organization has the capacity to give trainings in the local language, or the language of the target migrant group. I mean, this requires not only trainers who can deliver in that language, it also requires a big enough cohort of migrant entrepreneurs to make it worthwhile holding monolingual trainings for groups of migrants. So there are a lot of restrictions on this. The other thing, the other drawback of providing training, monolingual entrepreneurship training to groups of migrant entrepreneurs, is that it doesn't do anything to bridge that cultural divide, and it doesn't put the migrant entrepreneurs on the road to integration with their new society. So while you might get quick results with a quicker uptake of the knowledge and skills that you're providing through the training, you're not really doing anything to help integrate the migrants and to develop their language skills for the business world that they're going to be interacting in. So a note of caution there around those. Something else that I've seen work very well in a couple of organizations here in the UK is to have experts, oh sorry, I've gone on 2 slides there, have experts who can provide support within the classroom, linguistic support within the classroom, but not necessarily give the whole training in the language of the migrant entrepreneurs. So this might be bilingual or bicultural trainers or support staff who understand the language of both the host nation and the migrant group. This is great if all of your migrants speak the same language, but you might find that you have entrepreneurs from different migrant communities speaking different languages, and so you're forced then to deliver in the host nation language, which is not a problem. And what you can do in that situation is provide add-on support, linguistic support, modules or pre-session briefings to help the migrant entrepreneurs understand the language that you're going to be using in upcoming training sessions. So this might be, for example, you might have a training session coming up on lean startup methodology. And in advance of that training session, you might have a language focused session with the migrant entrepreneurs to give them the language around some of the core concepts that you'll be talking about. Yeah, so you're preparing them linguistically for the content that they're going to be receiving in an upcoming training session. This means you can be a lot more agile with it and a lot more focused. It means that the language sessions can just be maybe half an hour add-on in advance of the training sessions, for example. And you might be able to provide additional sessions, language specifically geared to pitching or to marketing, that the migrant entrepreneurs might not have the ability to handle those situations. For all of this, I would really recommend that you talk to people who know about language and language development. We really need staff working on this linguistic side of things who know what they're talking about. So this is where partnering with other organizations might be something worth looking into if you don't have staff in your organizations who know about language training. We're going to look now at the cultural support that you can give to your, Bob, working through translators. Yes, it is an option. The issue of working through translators in a training room is it's very difficult if you've got a group in front of you to do simultaneous translation. So the translator translating everything that you're saying as you're speaking. It's very difficult to do that in a group because you have 2 people talking at the same time. And it also doesn't allow for group interaction. So what we were talking about earlier on about getting that group dynamic working, it very much maintains the separation. I would, I'd urge a kind of a co-facilitation format where maybe you have one facilitator who is bilingual, and that they can slip in a few words and phrases of immediate translation as and when they're needed. So you're not translating everything that the trainer has just said, but that requires someone with both language skills and technical knowledge to do that. But yeah, thanks for the question, Bob. That was that's good. So going back to culture, what support can we give migrant entrepreneurs in order to come to terms with the new culture that they're moving into? And when we talk about culture here, we're talking about a national culture. We're talking about values, behaviors, and the way people in a country interact. We're not really talking about here the contextual knowledge, the structures, the systems necessarily. Now this can be done with sorry, I'm just looking at the chat here. Boris in Russia. Okay, yeah. So simultaneous translation with earpieces can be possible. Yeah. Yeah. So going back to local cultural training. So if you're working with new arrivals, this can be especially good. Giving migrants a session or two on how, for example, the British communicate. British tend to use a lot of indirect communication. They tend to use a lot of humor in their communication. So this kind of values and behavioral training to help your migrant entrepreneurs understand the mindsets of the communities and the local culture that they're moving to, and also the attitudes and the approaches towards business. How is business done in this country? How do entrepreneurs interact in this country? So cultural training is widely available. Usually it's provided for expats in business going out to do business in different countries. But it's equally important for migrants coming into a country to receive this kind of understanding of the values and the behaviors that influence people's interactions in the country. This can be a couple of sessions. I would recommend nothing shorter than a day, but maybe a couple of half-day sessions or 3 or 4 half-day sessions spread out over the course of a couple of weeks to allow the entrepreneurs to get some content and then go out into the community and see these interactions happening, and come back and be able to talk about those and to deconstruct and to interpret some of the behaviors that they've seen out and about in their daily lives. So that's one approach for providing local cultural training. And then we talked about contextual knowledge and building up contextual knowledge. A lot of expats, when they move to another country, are given relocation training. So this is things like, how does public transport work? How do the health systems work? How do we register with the local government? That kind of thing. Is it necessary to do that? So this kind of training, again, especially for new arrivals, can be really important to help them get their lives sorted outside of the classroom, so that when they're in the classroom, they can really focus on the content. Now, this again might not be within the remit of an entrepreneurship support organization, but if you are able to cross-refer your entrepreneurs to organizations that will provide this kind of support, it will again help them remove stresses from one part of their lives, which will enable them to focus on the practicalities of running a business. So again, Bob, I've found it helpful to learn something about the migrants' culture. Yes, and Bob, we're going to come on to that in the next session, in the next section, to talk about how we can support our trainers to empathize and to learn about the experiences of the migrants and how they see the world. So again, these are just a couple of areas of support that could be provided to migrant entrepreneurs to help them minimize those barriers to success and help them focus on the businesses that they'll be working on. So with language training, cultural training, contextual training, we do come to this ever-present issue of the difficulty of scheduling and balance. Now, entrepreneurs need to spend time in their business. That's a fact of life. But most of them also need training, and getting that balance right is really difficult. So in my business, I've got to develop customers, I've got to develop products, I've got to work on sales. But I also have all of this other training stuff. Yes, I've got my technical business training, but then maybe there's soft skills training I have to go to. There might be cultural training, there might be language training. And suddenly I have no time for training in my life. This is an issue not just with migrant entrepreneurs, but with local entrepreneurs as well. But it's even more of a problem for migrant entrepreneurs who we see might be juggling many more different areas of their lives that they have to quickly get up to speed with. There is no quick fix, no simple answer for this issue. There are only ever going to be 24 hours in a day. Human beings have limited capacity to take on information and to do different things. What we can do is make sure that we work closely with the migrants that we're working with, and to ask when are they available, how much time do they have. Maybe it means that we have to do, instead of doing intensive courses, week-long 9 to 5, Monday to Friday courses, it might mean that we have to run sessions at the weekends. It might mean that we have to run a half day every week. It might mean that we have to run evening courses. So really getting to know your communities and understanding when they might be available to fit this training around their businesses is really important. So having that two-way dialogue with your entrepreneurs and getting their inputs as to what format and structure of training is better for their lives. One of the questions that came up as we were discussing the content for this webinar was, do we mix cohorts, local and migrant entrepreneurs? Do we mix them together, or do we separate them? Now, there are pros and cons of doing this. Assuming you have large enough cohorts of migrants in your communities, then there are pros and cons of mixing or keeping them separate. So we're going to look at just a few of the positives and some of the possible negatives of mixing cohorts here with local and migrant entrepreneurs. So if we look at this first point, diversity of thought. So on the positive side, a lot of the research out there, a lot of the research on diversity and inclusion says that a diversity of thought, different perspectives, bringing that into a team and bringing that into group settings is great for innovation, it's great for idea generation, it's great for breaking down assumptions. However, it's only great for all of that if it's well managed, if the structures are put in place for people to be open and to have this open dialogue that generates all these new ideas and innovation, then yes, it's great. But we'll come to look at some of the negatives that can happen if it's not well managed. Tacit learning. So if you are mixing migrant entrepreneurs with their local peers, then they're going to pick up a lot of language, they're going to pick up a lot of cultural traits already without actually having to go to an explicit class on those things. So they're going to learn just from being around peers in their training groups. And also it gives them an immediate exposure to new networks. If you've got migrants who are isolated to their own migrant community networks, or they've come to your country with no one else that they know, exposing them to locals will immediately give them new networks. Now, some of the negatives of mixing cohorts. So if these mixed cohorts aren't managed well, then this can reinforce the isolation and the separation. If in your training groups you don't focus on building relationships, building that group dynamic, and getting the local and the migrant entrepreneurs to know each other and understand each other, then migrants can end up feeling isolated. They can end up feeling outside of the group because they don't understand the language, they don't understand the cultural references and the in-jokes that their peers are making, for example. So that can reinforce some separation. So we have to be careful to really work on that kind of integration in the training room above and beyond the training content. Can also slow things down or appear to slow things down for the local entrepreneurs. Again, if as Bob said, if we're using translation, then while the translation is going on, that might feel like dead time for the local entrepreneurs. And we'll come to look at culturally appropriate content in a few minutes, but it can be difficult for trainers to ensure that all of their content is appropriate and accessible to everyone, linguistically, culturally. So a lot of things to think about there. We've got a question from Anna. Oh, hello, Anna. What about mixing only in some sessions? Yeah, it depends on the shape of your training, Anna. If it's I don't know, if it's a training where the groups will work better if the groups are consistent and people keep coming back and seeing their peers every week and building that relationship, and learning is coming from the group rather than from the trainer, then having people coming in and leaving that training group can be disruptive, not just for the migrants but for the locals as well. But great question. Yeah, thank you for that. So what can we do about this? Just some best practice from what I've seen out in the network and what some of the research has shown. If you're going to mix, then really focus on building that trust and building relationships, building that psychological security within the group, so that everyone feels comfortable learning together. And you can do this by emphasizing the beneficial nature of that diverse, the diverse thoughts, the diverse ideas, the diverse perspectives within the group. So any exercises that you can have that encourage blue skies thinking outside the box, bringing different perspectives. Migrant entrepreneurs can really add a valuable different perspective on this. in monocultural groups, where groupthink or everyone thinking the same thing can be a big problem for entrepreneurs. Buddy systems, peer group systems. So if you've got a group that are going to be together for a long time and you have quite a large group, then break those down into smaller groups, 3-4 people, where the entrepreneurs can work together closely and build a bond of trust in that small group, which might be a lot easier than building a bond of trust with a big group or everyone in a group of, say, 20 in a training group, for example. So where you can, keep the groups small, because this means migrants who are having problems with language will find it easier to get to know the speech patterns of 1 or 2 or 3 other people in the group, rather than having to cope with the differences of everyone within the group. And we've mentioned this before, pre-course orientations on language and culture. And you can run those beforehand, or you can run them in parallel to the technical content. So as we mentioned before, little add-on, half an hour here, half an hour there, that can really bring the migrant entrepreneurs up to speed, so that the local entrepreneurs aren't feeling that they're having to move more slowly, which can build up resentment in a mixed group. Okay, so 10 minutes left. We've got a fair bit of content to go through, so I'm going to try and whiz through this quite quickly, but please feel free to keep the questions coming. So we're going to look now at how we can best equip our trainers for working with migrant entrepreneurs. I know that from my work in YBI, the trainers that work with organizations come in all shapes and sizes. Some of you have in-house trainers who do a lot of your training and develop the content themselves, and that's great. But others of you work with other entrepreneurs who come in to volunteer. You work with volunteers from business. You work with subject matter experts who might not necessarily be trainers or facilitators themselves, but they're just great in one subject. So what we're going to look at now is how we really give all of these people the skills to work with entrepreneurs, migrant entrepreneurs. And I think the first thing that I'd recommend is implanting this idea that the world in which we exist is not the only world. This quote from Anais Nin, we don't see things as they are, we see things as we are. Our perception of the world around us is colored by our own cultural lenses. And so the first big step for a lot of trainers working with migrant entrepreneurs is to realize that the way the trainer sees the world is not necessarily the way the world is. It's just our interpretation. One good example of when this really comes into play is when entrepreneurs in your training group are reacting in a way that you might see as negative. Maybe you ask a question and they're not giving a response. And I might think, oh, they're not giving a response because they're not engaged, because that's how I would react if I wasn't engaged. But we've got to tell ourselves, well, that's the way I see the world. And we've got to start asking ourselves, what are the different possible ways of seeing the world? And in that example, it might be that entrepreneurs aren't asking questions because they're trying to show respect to you as the trainer. And if I ask a question, it means I might be putting doubt on you, or it might come across as disrespectful. So we need to start thinking of the ways in which we act, the kind of culturally programmed ways in which we act, and stepping outside of that to see different possible values and behaviors. So in cross-cultural training, we work a lot with the iceberg model, and this shows that culture is like an iceberg. There's the small part of culture that is above the waterline that you can see. These are our ways of speaking, our humor, our dress, our ways of interaction. Do we hug? Do we kiss when we meet someone, for example? These are all the areas of culture that are above the waterline, and most people can articulate those visible areas of their own culture quite easily. However, what it's difficult to articulate quite often for most people is what lies below the water. What are the invisible things that shape you culturally? These are your values, your beliefs, your worldview, your idea of what is acceptable and what's not acceptable. And even for our own culture, we can find this very difficult to articulate what lies below the waterline. So the first thing that we can do for our trainers is to help them to understand their own culture, help them understand their own worldview, their own assumptions of right or wrong. And I do this sometimes with people in the UK. I get them to explore, well, what does it mean to be British? Why do we act the way we do? Why do we joke? Why are we indirect? Why do we not want to cause offense, for example? And it's quite an eye-opening experience for many people. Bob, we're going to get onto power and hierarchy in a minute. Just looking at your comment in the chat there, Bob. Also, empathy training, diversity and inclusion training for trainers can be really useful, because it helps us question our biases and our interpretation of the way the world works. There's a lot of empathy training out there, a lot of organizations focusing on diversity and inclusion at the moment, some of it better than others. But this can be a way to help trainers moderate their behavior. And also another way that we can support our trainers is to give them focused cultural training on the cultures of the target groups, the migrants that we're working with. So, for example, if you're working with a lot of migrants from the Middle East or from certain countries, what are the cultural traits, the cultural values within those countries? I've just got a few examples of the things that we can be thinking of in this area of culture to help expand our minds in this area. One of the cultural clashes that quite often comes up, I see, is attitudes to time, culturally based attitudes to time. These scales that I've got here are based on the work of Erin Meyer from her book, The Culture Map. And you can separate out, as an example, attitudes to time. There are some cultures that see time in a linear way. So A happens, then B happens, then C happens. There are deadlines. And things should be done on time and well organized. Then at the other end of the spectrum is this idea of a flexible attitude to time, and this idea that things can happen at the same time. Multitasking is part of the norm. Setting out plans is fine, but those plans should be flexible and adaptable. So two different ways of approaching time. Now, Bob has just brought up an interesting question about stereotyping in cultural training. It is an issue. And I was just about to mention that these dimensions are a guide to help us work out what could be going on. So, for example, in Erin Meyer's research, she puts these different countries at, generally speaking, these places on the spectrum. But there is the danger of saying that for example, oh, all Germans are very much punctual and on time. That's not the way that this works. Generally speaking, as a culture, if you average out everyone, there's a tendency to a preference for things to happen in a linear way in Germany, for example. But as we know, individuals are all individuals. What it's useful for trainers to, thanks for that, Guillaume. Yeah, exactly. I was just thinking of yoga as well. Yeah, what these dimensions are really useful for is to give your trainers a tool to help them interpret possible reasons for the behaviors that they might see. So if, for example, you have an entrepreneur in your classroom who is constantly on their phone, or maybe they step out of the training room quite frequently during the training session, this could be because they have a much more flexible view of time, and that they are not being rude to you. They are just they're just acting in a way where they feel that they can multitask and they can focus on different things and react in a fluid way. As a trainer, as a British trainer, if people are stepping in and out of my training rooms, I get quite upset. But I have to sometimes hold myself back and say, well, that's my cultural value making me upset. That is my view of the world making me upset. So this can really help trainers, if they understand these different cultural dimensions, to help see where the issues or the behaviors are coming from, and not to make value judgments about those. You can ask some probing questions if you see a behavior, to really find out why these behaviors are happening. I'm going to skip on a little bit because I'm conscious that we are running close to the deadline. So just a quick look at some of the other cultural dimensions that it could be useful for trainers to think about. How is trust built? Do your trainees trust you as a trainer because you're competent and you know the types of things that you're talking about, you know the content well, or do they trust you because they know you as a person and who you are? These are two different ways of forming trust that are quite prevalent in different cultures around the world. Emotional and physicality. So there are cultures that are much more neutral in their expression of emotion, and there are cultures that are much more expressive. If you're working with entrepreneurs who are from very expressive cultures, but they come to live in Northern Europe, for example, where we might be much more reserved, they might feel much more isolated. So, or vice versa, if you as a trainer are putting in activities that require a lot of physical contact that your migrant entrepreneurs don't feel comfortable with because of cultural values, this isn't an area where you might have to adjust your training content. So what I would say with these dimensions is that they are a way, getting to know these cultural dimensions is a way for trainers to examine their own behavior and examine the behavior of their participants, and ask themselves questions about, okay, why is this behavior happening? And how should I handle it in a culturally sensitive way? So Bob was right to ask about stereotyping, but I like to see these dimensions as a guide rather than hard and fast rules about you are British, therefore you are reserved and indirect. Yeah, so that's just one approach that we can give to equip our trainers with some skills to handle these things. I'm just going to skip on to a final couple of pieces about language. Native speaker, if you are a native speaker delivering training to a group of non-natives, we quite often don't realize how difficult native speakers can be to understand. I actually teach English to native speakers of English to help them become better communicators in their own language when they're working across cultures and internationally. So really working with your trainers to help them cut out their jargon, cut out their idiomatic speech, to make their language more accessible, is really worthwhile. And helping them develop empathy for non-native speakers of a language. So all of those things that we talked about earlier on in the linguistic barriers. How do we enable non-native speakers who maybe are monolingual and they might not know what it's like to speak another language? We really need to help them empathize with the migrant entrepreneurs in their classrooms who might be struggling with training in a different language. And we might have to factor in more time into our training sessions to make sure that explanations, understanding, and discussions are all taking place in an inclusive way. So just some quick tips linguistically for working with people in your native language, but who are not native speakers of your language. So start noticing your own use of idiom and jargon. Having someone there in the room with you who can point it out to you is very useful. Videoing yourself and watching it back with the specific purpose of looking for all of your own idiom and jargon is really uncomfortable, but it's very useful. Oh, thank you, Anna. That's great. Pace. So don't slow down too much. It can be condescending if you slow down too much, but around 75% of your native speed, just to help people pick out the words that you're saying. And get comfortable with silence and pauses, especially if you're working with a group of people who are largely non-native speakers. Get comfortable with those silences because people might need longer to formulate their answers. They might need longer to process the questions that you ask them and then formulate the answers they're going to give. So if you jump in with follow-up questions or clarifications, you might be breaking their thought patterns. And rather than checking, do you understand that? Using open questions to get the entrepreneurs to mirror back the content that they've just heard. So we are 3 minutes over. I was just going to wrap up very quickly with a slide on general tips. What can we do to improve our training programs for migrant entrepreneurs? Challenge our own assumptions, challenge our worldview, challenge the way that we see the world, and try to see it from the perspectives of the migrants who are coming into our training rooms. This will help us adapt the content that we think is appropriate and really make it appropriate. Focus on building trust and psychological security in your groups. This will really help remove that isolation that a lot of migrants can feel, and embrace the difference. If strange and crazy ideas come up from your migrant entrepreneurs, embrace those because they are the seeds of innovation. Support and develop your trainers. We've just talked about that. So don't just throw your trainers into a mixed group. Give them some support in advance. And use these cultural dimensions as a guide and not as a rule. So don't stereotype, avoid stereotyping, but use these kind of hints and tips around what could be the differences and the issues going on to help yourself explore further into what the issues and the behaviors are. Slightly beyond time, but we got there. Thank you for all of your comments and questions. I'm happy to stick around to answer comments and questions. Guillaume has just put the link to the EMUP program in the chat. And yeah, I'd like to thank you for your interactions and your attention. Guillaume, is there anything that you would like to add at the end here?
No, just thank you very much, Chris, for sharing your knowledge, your experience, and for being a great facilitator, as Anna said, also for non-English native speakers. Thank you all for your participation. You have the link to the website of MNAP. Thank you to YBI also for sharing their Zoom technology and managing the webinar. India, do you want to share some information about YBI?
Yes, so hi everyone, I'm India from Youth Business International. We are a network of, I think it's 54 organizations now around the world, and we work with organizations that work with entrepreneurs specifically, and we are part of the EMUP consortium, which is, as Guillaume explained, a group of organizations working for to kind of improve the climate for migrant entrepreneurs. And we will be hopefully in September issuing a report about migrant entrepreneurship. So if anyone is really interested in helping us conduct that research or add their opinion or anything, please get in touch with either me or Guillaume, or yeah, because we would love to have any kind of extra information or anyone involved. That would be fantastic. So yeah, I'll leave my email address here in the chat box, just if anyone wants to contact me.
Okay, thank you very much, India. Thank you, Chris. Thank you all, and see you next Tuesday.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.